record to the cloud, and we're now recording. Welcome to the Open Science Community Delft's first ever Open Science coffee session. My name is Emmy Tang. I am the Open Science Community Delft's coordinator and the facilitator of this session. As we're starting, this is an event that is organized by the Open Science Community Delft. So the code of conduct of the community is active during the session. Just putting the full link in the chat so that you go there and have a look at the code. It outlines what we basically don't want you to do. And so we have a zero tolerance for harassment. If you experience any harassing behaviors on this call in the next hour, please use the reporting procedure on the code of conduct. That will be most likely emailing me. And in case it's me who is committing that harassment, then you are advised to contact the relevant TU Delft authorities for the details on the code of conduct. With that, today we are very, very grateful to have our three amazing panelists with us today. So the format of how this will go, I will start the session off with some questions for our panelists. And then afterwards, we will open the floor to all of your questions and comments. So while the panelists are sort of speaking, you can put your questions in case you don't want to remember them for the until the end in the Zoom chat, and I'll relay them to the panelists who go wherever appropriate. And so just an introduction of who's with us today. We're very grateful to have Anton Akhmerov, Associate Professor at the Department of Quantum Nanoscience and the Kavli Institute of Nanoscience at the Technical University of Delft. Stephen Eglen, Professor of Computational Neuroscience at the University of Cambridge and the co-founder of a project called CODECHECK, which we'll definitely go to later. And then last but not least, Djura Smits, a research software engineer at the Netherlands eScience Center. So I hope that's clear. If you have questions, put them in the chat. I'll try my best to answer them. But I'll start with asking our panelists to introduce themselves briefly to everyone. Djura, if we could start with you.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so my name is Djura. I'm a research software engineer at the eScience Center. And so I started working there last year at the beginning of the pandemic. I have a background in artificial intelligence, but yeah, for the last couple of years, I've mainly worked in the industry. So yeah, commercial businesses as a data engineering and data science consultant for various companies. For example, nu.nl, the news site, also Rijkswaterstaat, so for the government, all kinds of things. So yeah, that's mainly my experience.
Fantastic. And then Stephen?
Thank you, Emmy. I'm Stephen Eglen, a professor of computational neuroscience here in Cambridge, UK. I have a long-standing interest in open science and reproducible research, and checking code in a very light touch sense, as you'll probably hear later, is something I've been interested in for probably about 10 years now. It's taken us a while to get where we are, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing everybody's thoughts today on this topic.
Thank you, Stephen. And Anton?
Yeah, morning, everyone. I am a researcher in a theorist in quantum physics, and so code is basically so over years I've realized that I find it easier to read code than to read manuscripts, and this is in a part of why I'm interested in the topic in today's topic. Another reason, of course, is like code is a lot of our product is either obtained via code or is code itself. So that's great.
Definitely, thank you, Anton. All right, so we've briefly talked about code and how we worked with them. So I want to ask our panelists what code review, this term, means to you, and why do you think it's important in research? Maybe we can start again with Djura.
Yeah, code review. Yeah, it can mean a lot of different things. I think that the context is always very important. Yeah, for example, in industry, you review code of a peer, and then you look at, for example, maintainability. You look at a lot of different things. But in in academia, in science, I think the main importance is reusability. Is this code actually going to be reusable? But yeah, I also work together in a team on research code, and then it's also a bit about transferring knowledge. So there's a lot of different things that can come out of code review. And yeah, also another side effect is I think that if you know that your code is going to be reviewed, you have an incentive to do better, to be more critical of your work. So those are just a couple of things.
Fantastic. And Stephen?
Thank you. So I think there's a lot to learn from, as Djura has indicated, from sort of what happens in industry and sort of good standards to adopt to. And I think in academia, we're terrible by and large at doing this, but I think we are catching up. So my approach is probably to think of a bar and try and make the bar as low as possible for code review. So to me, code review doesn't mean sort of sitting over and looking in depth at what the code is actually doing. It's really something as simple as, does this code work, right? Does this code exist and does it work? Because I think in science, in a lot of domains in research, we're not at the point yet of routinely sharing the code to support the arguments in manuscripts. And so for me, code review is starting from a very low base point of just saying, is that code available, and does it generate any results anywhere near close to what's in the paper? So I'm very much at the low end of trying to make things as easy as possible for people to get started with what we call code review in a very light touch sense.
Very interesting, Stephen. Sure, we'll get back to that in just a second. Anton.
Yeah, so I completely agree with the aspects that Djura and Stephen brought up, but I think there is one important omission there, and this is I'm looking back at my personal both trajectory and experience, and I think a code review is one of the important learning mechanisms in the craft. So some in the teacher qualification and I think also software carpentry tells the same thing. The main way, the most reliable way to improve is to have somebody with more knowledge look at your work and give you feedback. And code review, I think, is the main mechanism by which this can be done in coding. So that's and this is not to anyhow diminish the importance of code review as a means of assessment, of validity assessment, but that's yet another thing to keep in mind.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've just had a glimpse of how broad this subject of code review is and how many different reasons or importance for doing this there are. Anton, I find it very inspiring that you mentioned this being sort of a feedback and learning process. I wonder if you have sort of a specific experience or memory in your head that that you've had with code review in the past.
Oh, I don't think it's a specific memory, but I think most of the things that I learned were either reviewing code of somebody who is more experienced than me, or not necessarily more experienced, but just knows other things, or by having my code reviewed. So I mean, I mean, also since software engineering is a craft, there is not a single threshold where you learn something and it's like, wow, I know kung fu. It's a process, and you pick things up slowly, one thing at a time. Well, okay, I guess so perhaps one thing that I would like to bring up, yes, at some point I realized that I would like to improve coding practices in my own group. So I decided to run regular code reviews, so discussions that are exclusively focusing on the software part of the product and of the work, and not on the logic. And I remember realizing that well, it turns out a fair decade of coding experience makes a difference, and I should not expect that everybody starts perfect. So without looking at people's code, you actually don't know where they are and what they struggle with, or what they would benefit from. I also thought initially that you can somehow make a course and you say, this is the list of things to do. Please follow these rules. And now I don't think it's anyhow close to reality. Because different questions are relevant at different stages of one's development.
Yeah, definitely lots to unpack there, but thank you for sharing your experience. Stephen, I wonder if you have, a memorable code reviewing experience in the past.
Thank you. Probably the one that springs to mind with relating to the CODECHECK project that Daniel Nist and I have been working on is last summer, where we were approached to do a CODECHECK review of what I will call the Imperial College model of COVID. So for those of you most of you are outside the UK, I think, there was a model proposed by Imperial College that was instructive, or was seen to be instructive, in pushing the UK government into a lockdown in March 2020. And this was incredibly controversial from all angles. On the one hand, people who were against the lockdown were saying, well, what the heck is this? How can a model predict what's going on? Scientists who were very curious to see what the model, everybody was suddenly an epidemiologist and wanted to look at this. And everybody was frustrated that the model wasn't available. And quite rightly, the team at Imperial had put it together in a rush. They admitted that this was a model, code base that had evolved since the early 2000s, I think, from, obviously not modeling COVID, but modeling other transmissible diseases. And it was all done in a bit of a rush, and it was a bit of a mess. So their first priority was they actually released the code together with, they had some GitHub engineers, I think, help them tidy things up. But even when that was available, there were a lot of people criticizing the software engineering, right? There's always something you can poke at. It's a huge code base, right? Thousands and thousands of lines. So people who hated the model were still saying, oh, well, it's no good just having the code available. We don't know how it was run. So thanks to a diligent editor at Nature, they got in touch with the Imperial team, and the Imperial team were incredibly keen. They were actually very keen to have their work code checked to try and deflect all of this criticism about their model. And one of the problems was not just having the code base, but it was actually having all of the associated data files and parameter settings, which hadn't been released. So we set about this collaboration where they shared with me everything I needed, all of the data, all of the parameter settings. I had to pick up on the fly some new high performance compute techniques and but in a couple of weeks we got it all sorted. And the good news was actually the key results were in fact quite reproducible. Now this wasn't what I would call a typical code review, right? I didn't go through and say, right, well, okay, that line corresponds to this differential equation and dot, 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 dot. But what it means is that somebody independently, in this case me, could say, well, that code base with that data set, put them together, I can independently run it, and I get results very similar to what was shown in their original technical report from March 2020. And that actually, you know, Nature were involved in this, so they obviously wrote a piece about it. Imperial were very happy because they got to show that it was, you know, it wasn't just their results in their hands, which I think is important for scientists to say, you know, that somebody else has independently checked it. So I think that really, I think, was quite instructive. And it, you know, it's obviously good doing something real world in the middle of a pandemic to show that, you know, we were sort of using models that were, for want of a better word, reliable and useful. So I think that actually was probably our biggest success so far in CODECHECK.
Thank you for sharing that, Stephen. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how, you know, especially the attention on the, you know, the pandemic and the validity of the model, and how you've been involved in this process amongst, you know, a bigger discussion as well, with everyone else having a poke at the code base. Djura, it's also a question from Nerlin as well, but I wonder if, you know, with your experience in the industry, what do you think, you know, are the differences between the code reviewing process in the industry and your time now at the eScience Center? And if you have any sort of specific memories of the difference that could highlight this difference, maybe.
Yeah, so yeah, specific memories, I'm not sure, but so yeah, what I noticed when I first started working as a research engineer is how it's much more of a creative process, because in the industry there's often like a software architect who has already kind of mapped out like the large yeah, so the basic idea of what you're gonna do, and the plans are quite fixed, and then you just go implement them, and then you can in the review you kind of like your peer is checking is this filling the requirements of the the user story, or yeah, so that's how it more or less goes in the industry. And then you have as a research engineer, so I'm actually I'm often trying to still find the shape of what is it I'm going to create. It is much more of a creative process. And so there was also so I did get some code reviews on like I think that code reviews, like in that very vague beginning, can sometimes be counterproductive, because you're still trying to form the idea in your head. And yeah, so for me, I'm just thinking with coding. It's just my way of thinking to type it out, say. And if you at that point say cut it off and let somebody else have a look at it, they will have a lot of questions that you cannot answer, because you don't have the complete idea in your head. So I've become so while code reviews are in some places in the industry like it's like a religion, like you cannot merge code without having it reviewed. I've become much more lenient in that, because I'm creating a lot of prototypes that I haven't had reviewed, because I'm still creating. It's not the final product. It's so, and actually reviews kind of block that creative process. So there's a huge difference between having code reviews in the industry and code reviews in academia. And I think also that the priority is very different. So you don't necessarily need to follow the same standards, especially with like if you're creating a prototype of something or a data analysis, it doesn't have to have the same level of like maintainability as like something that you have to put into production and that needs to run all the time, and that people keep developing on. So that's, yeah, there's a huge difference there.
Thank you, Djura. Yeah, we sort of went through a little bit of what code review means and your experiences of doing it and what you've learned from it. And I wonder, you know, again, going back to these experiences, to our panelists, what are the key challenges that you've seen, or observed, or experienced when you're, you know, reviewing code in as a reviewer or as a reviewee? Maybe we could start with Anton.
Well, okay. One of the recent rather disappointing experiences was when I asked the editor to actually approach the authors of a manuscript to share the code with me as a reviewer, and the editor just replied, "We don't do this kind of thing." Now I have to say, so that was the end of the story. So I picked up a habit as a reviewer of a manuscript, even if the journal does not require the authors to provide their code or data for review, to still ask for it, because I realized it's a very low effort way to improve good practice in academia, just exclusively on my side. I don't need a large bureaucratic organization to approve on it, and basically the authors typically will not object because it's in their interest to be on the referee's good side. The editors don't object usually don't object because it does improve the quality. Once actually, when I asked the authors to share the code in submission of the code, they said, "Hey, you know what? We also found a slight mistake, so now our figure 5 looks a bit different." Which was basically improving the article quality in a way that I couldn't do without by just reading through the results and without actually any effort on my side. So that was fun.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just wondering if Stephen, if you have any sort of relevant experience there as well.
So, I mean, yes, Anton, I mean, you and I must be of a similar vein when writing our reviews, because I do similar. And one of the obvious reasons is to get around this annoying statement that editors still allow in papers, which is data available upon reasonable request, right? I mean, especially the word reasonable, right? I mean, I'd like to know, you know, how they define reasonable. It's in most areas. I mean, you know, in areas of clinical research, of course, sharing data is non-trivial, but for basic research, sharing of data in digital formats as a supplement to the paper, to me, is a no-brainer. And even if as a reviewer, I don't intend to poke at it, I'd like to see it so that I know when it's published, it's available, because otherwise we all know what happens. It disappears. The code and data will, you know, the student or the postdoc leaves the lab and it's gone, right? So it needs to be captured during that review cycle. But I guess coming back to your original question about the challenges, Emmy, I think the one thing I'd like to highlight is the important issue of resource, which is people's time. I think doing a code review, and I've seen people do brilliant jobs in, you know, in code reviewing, when people do it because they're really interested and they want to get into the problem. But most people don't really have time to routinely do that. It's a real big ask to spend, you know, the thing that we do in CODECHECK is, you know, it's not a deep review. There's no way that I could have done what I would call a code review of the COVID model. First of all, the COVID model has never been written down in its entirety ever. right? It's all in somebody's head, but at least on the code, it's sort of there. So you've got nothing independent to really check. But the time it takes, these are complicated models. Anything bigger than one or two pages of code really takes a lot of head scratching, unless you're a real expert and you know the domain specific, for example, the paradigms that are being used, the modeling systems and so forth. So it's really demanding to do this. And the critical thing is within a research group, I think there's a selfish reason for doing it, to try and dedicate the time, because you want your results to be strong before publishing them. But during the review process, people just don't have time to do this. And I think peer reviews at breaking point, asking people to do more in peer review, to go beyond the scientific review to doing code review, it's close to impossible. And I think Nature Human Behavior a few weeks ago just announced that they're going to start to do code review. I have no idea how they're going to implement it. I'd really like to, if anybody on the call knows, because they're setting them. So I would just routinely send most of my papers that I could to there, because we'd all love to have our code reviewed in the thing. So I think resource is a real big issue to doing this properly.
Definitely. I think a lot of folks in the chat agrees as well. I wonder, Stephen, if you have a sort of rough estimate in terms of scale of like days and weeks and hours, like how much time approximately does this code review, for example, in the CODECHECK process take?
It really varies on, again, we try and set the bar as low as possible. So if one figure or table is reproducible, it can pass CODECHECK. So, that could just take, an hour or two. If the author has left their code in a state such that there's a sensible README, or that there's a virtual container or a Docker file or a make file or something that just means you can press go, and then that's all smooth sailing. That's like just the compute time. But more typically, what happens is something breaks. The author forgets some dependency, so there's a period of iteration between the code checker and the author, which can go on typically over the order of, a scale of a couple of weeks is quite typical, I would say. We've not had ones go on longer than that. And that's with things that, again, probably the COVID one was the largest scale where we had to use HPC and really thrash it to get those runs done in a week. So I think compute time is also an issue there. But it's significant. It's more than just doing a review of a scientific peer review, I would say.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that insight. Djura, I wonder what you see as sort of challenges in your code review experience.
Yeah, so I was thinking more about egos. And yeah, first of all, so I work with PhD students, and then they are sometimes hesitant to show their code. They think, oh, it's probably there's a lot to pick at, so they keep it private. And so convincing them to just show it, and then it's my role to also be encouraging, not to give reasonable feedback and be encouraging as a reviewer. And create a transparent atmosphere where everybody feels safe. I mean, code can always be implemented differently. So and there's no shame. Sometimes I write terrible code, and I mean, it also depends on how much time you have, or if you are quickly trying something out. So that's that's just something that I wanted to mention. And also challenges, my own fragile ego is also a main challenge. Quite often if my code is reviewed, my first reaction is to be really defensive and to reply. Usually I start to reply, and then explain the reviewer why they are wrong, and then the adrenaline kind of dies down, and then I think like, they actually have a point. a colleague of mine said that his way to approach reviews or being reviewed as like you read the review and then just take some time for yourself before you do anything else, which I think is a very nice way to kind of to overcome that. So that's and it's all part of like creating an open and friendly atmosphere. There are different ways to review as well. There are different ways to give feedback. Some ways are more will make the reviewee more open to your suggestions than other ways of communication. So yeah, just something to keep in mind.
Definitely, sort of intrinsic defensive mechanisms not very helpful there. Thanks for this sharing this, Djura. Just staying with you, Djura, for a second. Lisa asked, are there any tips or resources on writing code from a sort of reviewee's point of view to make it easier for other people to review your code?
So to make it easier for people to review your code. So I think reviewing can be done at different stages, right? So what Stephen is talking about with the COVID with the model, but there's also like so for me and my team, there is like we have regular reviews, like merging every kind of feature into the code base. So it kind of depends, but I think knowing about best practices and about making code reusable, that always helps. Just general best practices and using Git. So you're always writing in like a separate branch, and then you merge it into the general code base. I think Anton also wants to add something to that.
Go ahead, Anton.
Yeah. So now there are many different contexts in which review can occur, and I'm not sure, Lisa, which one what you have in mind. But I often found, I'm not sure. So first of all, in-person review is often more convenient because the reviewer can ask what this is, and if you can accommodate this and have the person who reviews your code reserve time for this, this is extremely useful. Not having that. So first of all, one of the points of review is for you to learn what you don't know. So for that, you cannot prepare. But what does help a lot, and I'm assuming that you're not merging a feature into existing stable code base with its own practices, because there the process is streamlined and you are going to see how things work. But if you have the code you've written for yourself, and you want somebody to give you feedback, it's extremely helpful to first of all provide sort of an overview of what is there. Like this is the script where I'm running things. This is where all the implementation lives. This part I recently implemented it. I'm not really sure if it works or not. So this kind of information of your assessment and of each different part and their role is quite helpful.
Yeah, no, it's sort of like having a map to your code almost, and pointing out the bits that, you know, just being transparent with how you feel about it, and asking really to openly for that feedback. I really find that quite very inspiring from what you say, Anton. Stephen, any tips for reviewers and reviewees to make the code review experience a bit easier and more effective?
Not really, just to say, I think just getting started is the biggest hurdle. And once you're in the swing of things and you learn from different people, you just sort of find your own cadence. So, you know, just try something, and you know, and be open to other ideas. I do think it's nice to learn from a community beyond the research group. So, for example, the Turing Institute here in the UK have this, I think, beautiful project called the Turing Way. And the barriers to learning other people's code or to reviewing other people's code is obviously lowered if there's a sort of a consensus about style and about how you tackle projects. So lowering anything we can do as in communities to lower the sort of cognitive barriers to sort of studying a code base is obviously going to be helpful. So I think just looking at what larger communities are doing and learning from those, picking the best bits can often help. But I realize that's a big ask. So I think just getting started is already a great step forward.
Yeah, sort of like getting into any type of habits, the beginning is always harder. But I really like, there's a comment in the chat as well from Simon about, just being comfortable with critical feedback and building that culture that's okay as well, just to make it a bit more, make it normal. That will probably help as well. I want to come back to something that we touched on a bit earlier and perhaps dive into a bit more detail about sort of code reviewing as part of the publication process. Anton, you've touched on sort of submitting the paper with data and code to journals. I wonder if you sort of can elaborate a little bit on that. And and there's also a related, maybe you'd like to address that as well, a related question from Parash about a post-publication review. Will that help?
Well, so I definitely hope that the established practice of how publication works will change and to a large extent go extinct, because I think it's quite outdated. So post-publication review, absolutely, it's a great thing. Projects are evolving, so by all means. However, in the current practice, I think Stephen expressed a sentiment. I mean, the code doesn't need to be beautiful. It needs to be valuable, and preferably it needs to work. I mean, so the second, I'm even willing to negotiate on the second part, because just seeing, because there's so much hidden and not so much of important information that's missing from publications, that just having code in the first place is already an important milestone. Now, I also saw in chat people. And this is a sentiment I encounter extremely frequently, and that's guarding one's own advance in a domain. Like, I worked a lot on the code. Now it's mine. Now my competitors need to do all the same silly work that I have done, and so I don't find this argument defensible. Certainly not from a point of view why other members of communities should entertain your pettiness. But also at the same time, I just when sharing my own code, I think every now and so since there's no practice for code reuse in at least in our community, I didn't get a lot of feedback. But every now and then I hear, "Hey, I used this code from your paper. Thanks. Good, you've shared it." So as far as reviewing final product and the published code goes, I mean, so far I just seek to check that it's there and it roughly corresponds to what the authors claim it should do.
Thank you, Anton. I think that nicely goes to Stephen, who, with CODECHECK, you've tried to formalize, or at least find a model to formalize sort of a sort of code review process there. Could you tell us more about it? There's also a couple of related questions here. Is it RSEs who are involved in that process, or anyone? Yeah.
So if I can make a plug for our website, codecheck.org.uk, on there is a sort of getting involved button, and it takes you through to GitHub where people can sign up. We have a community of about 30 volunteers now. And I'm embarrassed to say we're at the stage now where there are, I think, about 4 of us who've done code checks, not because there's not work to be done, but we're struggling to try and think of a sustainable way to open before we open the floodgates. So I've been in touch with a couple of journals and they're very interested in integrating it into their workflow. A lot of journals are obviously interested in this as a way of increasing the sort of reproducibility angle of papers that they're publishing. And there's a couple of, maybe for the audience, I think there's a couple of dimensions that are worth elaborating on briefly. So one is, at what stage would you like to do a code check? So we've done it at several stages. We've done it, and probably the one that's most common is thinking about it during the peer review of the corresponding article. So one model is that when the scientific reviewers are looking at the article for the scientific content, we as code checkers can do the code check and just say, yes, this code, there's the code and there's the data and it does work, right? And just to, add to what Anton said, I think it's very, even if it doesn't work, if it doesn't work, it doesn't get the certificate. But we try and get to the point where we improve it such that it is going to get a certificate, because this is not about, again, with scientific peer review, we know that in some domains it's very cutthroat, and most papers are rejected from certain high profile journals. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to build people up and be collaborative during the process so that it does pass, because that's really what we're interested in. It could also be done after acceptance of the scientific article. So for example, our very first code check at eScience was done post editorial acceptance of the paper, but before publication. So by the time of publication, the code check had been done as well, and so it all nicely tied in. We have had one person approach us who wanted a code check before submitting it for peer review, to sort of help say to the editors, look, it's all there and it's already been checked. And we were very happy to do that. So I think there's lots of different models by which this process can take place. And I appreciate it. It's never, our ambition was never to say that the code is what we call correct. I think testing the correctness of code is out of our domain within CODECHECK. That's not something we're in. I think to do that is a big task, even lots more resources required, and I think it needs to be a lot more domain specific. What we're talking about in doing a CODECHECK is that people who are familiar with Python or R or MATLAB, as long as there's a decent README, they can probably do it. As long as they don't need any particular obscure hardware setups, they can do it. So we're trying to make things as easy as possible to get into from all possible angles. So our vision very much is that journals can take into this service at some point in their peer review process. The big stumbling block for us, unsurprisingly, is now funding to try and get somebody. It needs somebody to be a full-time editor almost to sort of sit and funnel requests from journals to the pool of code reviewers. And those code reviewers, Emmy, by and large, are early career researchers or RSC roles who are very interested in this process. And the comments have been very encouraging to the view of, I think this is more important than peer review, right? That's what, several people have said to me. And I think that, I think I'm not sure it's more important. I think it's a nice compliment, right? It's about trying to do this to try and make the scientific results, when they do appear, to be more reliable and reproducible.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Stephen. I just want to acknowledge that, a lot of this effort at the moment is falling on early career researchers and people who perhaps don't have the sort of formal capacities or any types of capacities to be doing this, to be honest. But what I'm hearing from you all in the last sort of half an hour and 40 minutes is that, you know, it's really encouraging to see that there are so many people like yourselves and journals and other organizations trying to, you know, experiment with this process, and we're at the stage where, you know, it's being done in many different ways, in different teams, smaller teams, bigger teams, in person, remotely, big projects, more projects. So I wonder, you know, my final question from myself, maybe we start with you, Djura. How do we move forward? What else do you think we should try? Or are there sort of the different players in academia, funders, publishers, institutions? How can we help support a vibrant code reviewing environment?
Yeah, I think that's at many different stages you can encourage open source as much as you can, and definitely I think at the early stage of developing this code, just you should already be you could already be open about it. So yeah, just pushing for open source as much as possible, I think is is the right way to go, and there are different ways in which you can do this.
Definitely, thank you. Anton?
Oh, easy. Let me just find the big switch which says code review and we go. No, I mean, commonplace code review is a culture change, and I recently ran a Twitter poll, inspired actually by this event, which is as representative as all Twitter polls are, but still 2/3 of responders, which for me probably means researchers sort of close to my domain, say that nobody ever looks at their code. So I think, like as an individual, there are several things one can do, and certainly as a reviewer, I mean, it's easy to ask for code to just submit. I found it personally a rewarding and fun experience to approach various organizations with which I interact and saying, why don't you do more? Like sending an email to an editor. Like it's very easy to take an existing bureaucracy as a fixed structure which will never change. But somehow talking to people without expecting a lot of change, but still hoping to bring an item on their agenda is productive, or maybe productive. So that's another thing. And by all means, well, publishing your code is also obviously a good idea. But another thing that I also want to bring up is not even formal code review after everything is done. That is actually by normal standards too late. So I think proposing your colleagues to review the code, and you don't need to be somehow more experienced. So if you have somebody's code, if you know that somebody in your environment works and implements something, and you find the topic interesting, offer to review their code and sit down, walk through it. I'm not sure. So I would hazard a guess that most people would not turn down such a proposal. Yeah, a lot of small things. That's pretty much it.
Thank you, Anton. And Stephen?
Thank you. So I just put a link into the chat from a paper by a colleague here in Cambridge, by Florian Markovich. It's called 5 Selfish Reasons to Work Reproducibly. If you've not read it, it's a very short piece and it's open access. So if you've got 10, 15 minutes to read it and you haven't read it, I recommend it. because it hits on the theme, which is that I think everybody here would agree that, you know, doing code review is a good idea. You know, being open and reproducible is a great idea. And this is all, you know, what we should be doing. But who's got time for it? Who's really got time to do all of these things? So rather than thinking about, you know, the sort of these mythical golden things that we should be working towards, it's to try and identify good selfish reasons, right? Why should people be doing it? What can they gain from it, as opposed to just thinking about what they give up from it? So just as the example that Anton said, is that one of the reasons we've highlighted for why we think people will selfishly want to do code reviews in the CODECHECK world is that it introduces them to colleagues in their field that they may not already know, and they get to have a one-on-one conversation with them. They are not hiding behind anonymous peer review. It's a direct conversation between the author of the code and the code checker. So this, I think, could be incredibly enlightening for somebody who doesn't, you know, who's just getting started and wants to make contacts with other research groups. They get to see the new findings in the field. They get to read the interesting papers before they're published. Although in many cases, of course, these are all often pre-printed as well. I don't think we've had a case yet where we've done maybe one, I think, where we've done a paper that hadn't been pre-printed. But it's to try and identify those selfish reasons. What can somebody gain from it, right? By checking other people's code. They're not just doing it as a service, right? Because this notion of service soon gets stretched incredibly thinly in academia. And we need to get away from that. So it's looking at trying to think about the good selfish reasons. One of the things that we've done on CODECHECK is to come up with, they write, you know, it's not like most peer review. So the CODECHECK certificate is publicly available. It's got a DOI, it's a citable object. We recommend that people can use them and cite them. And so again, they get credit through that way. Publishers are interested in putting these reviews on things like Publons. So again, you know, we try and visibly give credit to people that are doing these things. And I think the more that we can activate selfish mechanisms rather than always having to rely on people's altruistic reasons for doing service like code review, I think is important.
Thank you very much for that, Stephen. Yeah, ultimately, you know, we only have that much time, and it will be nice to, you know, have those arguments where, you know, it's really up to, it's really for ourselves. I am looking at the time, and there are loads of conversations and comments in the chat, which is wonderful to see. I'm sorry we probably don't have enough time to address all of those, but I wonder if our panelists have any sort of final comments regarding anything. Djura, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, so I just saw one question in the chat. Yeah, how can you push for open source? And yeah, I was just, so my answer is, like, maybe it's not possible for all researchers, but put your code, make your code public as early as possible. Give the right example, and yeah, make it part of yeah, in your research group, like make it part of the process. There's never time to do a review. It's always a hassle, but it improves your code a lot, and gives you new ideas. So it's yeah, it is quite a hassle. It's never, yeah, it's never easy, but it's still very valuable.
Definitely. Thank you, Djura. Maybe Stephen?
Thank you. Well, first of all, just to thank the OSC team at Delft for putting this on. I think it's been a very engaging hour. So thank you, Emmy and everyone. I've been really remiss at catching up with the chat. I apologize. But I saw there's one question from Jason about surely the correctness is the most important thing to be going for, rather than just checking that it runs again once. In some sense, yes, but our approach here is just to say we're, you know, there are other approaches. In our F1000 paper, we talk about dimensions of checking. Some of you may be familiar with things called the code ocean capsules, which various journals are trialing. These are notions of sort of containers that can run, what we say is they run forever for everyone, assuming you've got compute resource or you can pay to run them on CODECHECK. So that's reproducible forever for everyone. We're talking about doing it reproducible once for one person. So we're really at two other dimensions. You've added another dimension, which is, correctness, and we're not going there. Is this correct? But I just repeat that I think that is more down to the sort of the peer review process, right? How can we get an understanding about whether, then there's two issues. There's whether the description of the paper, when the paper of the model, some simulation model, for example, or some analysis, is that correct? And then does it map onto an appropriate implementation in the code? So there you've got to check two things. Is the idea right? And is the implementation right? And that mapping of the idea to the code, I think, would be really great to see, but I just don't see how. This is why I'm saying with the nature of human behavior, I really want to see how they're going to resource that, because that is a huge ask. So I agree, yes, it would be great to do it, but I'm just practically very worried about the human hours involved in doing that. But this is a moving conversation. I think that's important, right? 20 years ago, we were not routinely sharing data. We were not routinely sharing code. In some fields, like in genomics, it's fantastic. Genomics has really been a good example of where a lot of things are shared, both data and code. And other areas are catching up. In 20 years' time, I hope we're in a much better place, and a parallel conversation will be in a much higher level about what else we could be doing. But it's a continuously moving target, and I think we just got to do our best.
Beautifully summarized. Thank you, Stephen. Anton, any last comments?
Well, perhaps to bring up one dimension of code review that we did not actually check, and that is specific to research code, is the domain knowledge of the reviewers. Say, mature code bases can be reviewed by somebody that can be reviewed with relatively little effort by somebody that can code. Say this is why starting to contribute to Jupyter is straightforward. The code is really readable. Things are literally what they are. It's all great. You can just start implementing what you want. Now, this is the contrast with an obscure paper in a field where maybe a few hundred people even know the science behind. There, so review without domain-specific knowledge is hard because you basically don't know what anything means. And one of my PhD students actually submitted a paper for ReproHack, and I think this was an interesting perspective. I think we did get a decent grade, but at the same time, I realized that to somebody who knows what it's about, the code would look completely differently, because basically a reviewer that does not have the context can press the buttons and see that something happens. At the same time, say reading a code that the author submit alongside a paper, I often don't need to run it because it seems it looks good and everything is transparent, because often having the background knowledge really helps reviewing the code. So I'm not sure what follows out of this, because that means something. That means that you cannot just rely on broad pools of reviewers. And I also saw in chat somebody asked whether having a center providing code review as a service would be useful. And I think there the lack of domain-specific knowledge does become a big obstacle. So yeah, that's just one consideration to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. It's very, very complex. And our hope is really, I guess the panelists will agree with me here, that we keep trying and experimenting and learning from those experiments as we go. I know we're 1 minute past the hour, so those of you who need to hop off, thank you so much for joining us, and round of applause for our panelists today for sharing their experience and insights, and to all of you who have been keeping this chat really lively and going. Thank you. We'll be sharing a short summary of this discussion and recording on our website. So we'll send you an email when that's ready, and please let your friends know about it in case they couldn't make it in real time. And I just really, really want to say, we will continue this series. The hope is once a month. So I'm happy to announce that we already have a topic for next month. It's going to be on diversity and inclusion in research, technology, and design. So many of us are researching and prototyping solutions aiming to solve global issues from climate to health. But we're increasingly also seeing technology having unwarranted consequences, especially on marginalized groups in society. Our research, technology development, and design process is truly open for all to participate and engage in. If not, how can we change it? Join us October 6th, 12:45 to 1:45 p.m. Amsterdam time. I'm going to pop the link to register into the chat now. So please go ahead and please tell your friends as well. More information will be on our Twitter account and website as soon as we finalize everything. If you have any ideas for any topic that you'd like to discuss in these coffees in the future, please feel free to let us know. We have an open GitHub thread that is open for your ideas and suggestions. So please do let us know what you'd like to hear next. And if you are joining us from the Technical University of Delft and you'd like to stay updated to the events in the open science community in Delft, the Netherlands, and beyond, please join our community. That's it from me. Thank you very much once again for joining us today, and I hope you have a very good morning, afternoon, and evening.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording.
See you, everyone.